Next misleading expression, West Bank. The media incessantly uses the term West Bank, West Bank, West Bank, West Bank. It doesn't say Judea and Samaria. What it does say is that when Bibi or somebody else in Israel uses the term Judea, Samaria in a public statement, what he is using is, quote, the biblical term for the West Bank. Is West Bank a term that has been in use since biblical times? The answer to that is no. Here's a map in 1791 referring to what's called the West Bank today as Samaria and Judea. The United Nations in 1947 didn't say West Bank. It said the hill country of Samaria and Judea. This notion that Samaria and Judea, which are Hebrew origin names, are biblical terms, yes, they were biblical terms, but they remained in use all through the centuries until Jordan, after invading in 1948, renamed Judea and Samaria, quote, the West Bank, unquote, for the same reason that the Romans in 135, Adrian, renamed what had been known by them in our coins after that war, Judea Capta. They renamed it Palestine, not after Arafat's ancestors, but after the long-gone Philistines who had been defeated long before then by the same Babylonians that had finally defeated the kingdom of Judah. But that doesn't stop the media from saying West Bank over and over. I wrote a book about the continuous presence of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And in that book I found researching that book, I found a Christian pilgrim who in 1102, a man named Saulf, who came on the heels of the Crusaders. And he wrote that on this side of the Jordan River is the region called Judea, as far as the sea. And as Yoram Ettinger, an Israeli diplomat, pointed out, it was in April 1950 that the Jordanian occupation renamed Judea and Samaria as the West Bank. We shouldn't give up that historical name that's not just a biblical name, but remained in use all the way through from biblical times to the middle of the 20th century. President Obama recently said about a mountain in Alaska that had been called Mount McKinley, he said, we're going to put back the ancient name, Mount Denali. And there's a cartoon of Bibi saying, we couldn't agree with you more. Why does the media insistently call Judea and Samaria the West Bank? Because they love to compare Jewish settlers in settlements with Palestinian farmers and residents of the West Bank. Here's a couple examples. An article by the Associated Press in January of 2014, over and over and over again, contrasted settlers versus Palestinian farmers, West Bank villagers, settlers versus people, militant settlers versus Palestinians, over and over and over again. And this is the language that permeates Middle East reporting. And when you read this over and over and over again, you imbibe that the Arabs living there are the indigenous natives and the Jews are outsiders, settlers, and even colonialists. Other examples of the same thing. But ask yourself to compare these two expressions from a 2014 article by Reuters. Quote, 184 new homes in 2 Jewish settlements in the occupied West Bank. Compare that against Jewish communities in Judea, Samaria. It makes a tremendous difference between those two concepts in the minds of the public. 7th of the 10 misleading expressions, East, often capital E East, Jerusalem. Wikipedia defines East Jerusalem as it's known as including the Old City with all of its Jewish and Christian historical and religious places, as well as other areas to the far side of the 1949 Israel-Jordan military ceasefire lines. But this is Jerusalem. It's a city. Where do you draw a line between that city today? Between, quote, Jerusalem and, quote, East Jerusalem, as though they were two separate places, which they are not, and never were, except for the 19 years of the Jordanian occupation, if ever there was one, of part of the city. But just as it does in, quote, the West Bank, the media insistently talks about Jewish settlers in East Jerusalem. Nearly 1,500 homes in Jewish settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, over and over and over again, including calling the heart of Jerusalem occupied territory. Arab East Jerusalem, even they use. Traditionally Arab East Jerusalem. Jerusalem has had a Jewish majority, again, not just in ancient times, but in the 19th century, the middle of the 19th century, there were more Jews in Jerusalem than there were Muslims and Christians. And by the end of the 19th century, there were more Jews in Jerusalem than Muslims and Christians combined. And that has never changed. When we talk about Jerusalem before the 20th century, we're talking about the walled city, because people did not live outside the walled city because it was a domain of wild animals and burglars and thieves and brigands of all kinds. And it was the Jews who led the expansion of the city when it became just too crowded in the late 19th century to become, quote, New and Old, or East or West Jerusalem. And you have to bear in mind that Jewish presence in Jerusalem goes back 3,000 years without break, except during times when the Jews were expelled by the foreign occupier, in the wake of every time of which they came back as soon as they could. Sir Martin Gilbert, in his book Jerusalem, A Rebirth of a City, quoted a British visitor in 1847 that although we think of Jerusalem as a Muslim city, the Muslims do not actually constitute more than a third of the entire population. And British Consul Finn, not very much later, 1858, said, the British are no friends of the Jews in the end. The Mohammedans of Jerusalem are less fanatical than in many other places, owing to the circumstance of their numbers scarcely exceeding 1/4 of the population. This is in the middle of the 19th century, not after 1967. Here's an illustration graphically of the growth of the Jewish majority over the 19th and 20th centuries in Jerusalem, in which Jews are occupiers and settlers in, quote, East Jerusalem, unquote. Jerusalem was the capital of 3 states in the past 3,000 years. Judah, Judea, and Israel, all of them Jewish. Palestinian Arabs have not ruled Jerusalem for one day in history. And foreign Arabs ruled it in those dynasties between 636 and 1099. And even there were some breaks in that. So when the media says Israel captured East Jerusalem in 1967, Israel seized East Jerusalem in 1967, it's dating Jewish connection to Jerusalem, the heart of Jerusalem, to 1967, and that's about 3,000 years inaccurate. There's a question, and I'm skipping over here pretty much, of the New York Times questioning Jewish reality in the Temple Mount era. Very quickly, when Eilat Mizar discovered the Jewish things in the city of David, the New York Times, King David's palace, which it may be, dating from the 10th century BCE, the New York Times questioned whether Jews really had their origin and growth as a people in the city of Jerusalem, or whether that's Jewish propaganda offset by Arab narrative. And it's simply not true. A religious myth used to justify occupation and colonialism is the question that the New York Times raised in 2005, and it goes to the heart of contesting the Jewish claim to Jerusalem, and that claim is real, as demonstrated by archaeology and everything else. Next one, misleading expression 8, Israel's 1967 borders. Israel's 1967 borders, and his expression is used not just by opinion columnists like the Inquirer of Philadelphia's Trudy Rubin, House World Affairs columnist, but by headlines and news articles over and over. In 2011, President Obama, in a major speech, said that the starting point for peace negotiations and border drawings between the, quote, Palestinians, unquote, and the Israelis should be the lines that existed in 1967. But the Philadelphia Inquirer, for one, in its headline, said he said borders, but he didn't say borders, he said lines. There's a difference between, a very important difference between ceasefire lines and international borders. Borders have a international law gravitas that can supersede their temporary violation by one side or another. But ceasefire lines are temporary demarcations between the location of armies and a phase of wars between them. And when the fighting renews, the old ceasefire lines cease to have any meaning and are dispatched to history's dustbin. The 1949 Israel-Jordan armistice agreement went out of its way to say that the green line, because it was drawn with a green pen, is a military ceasefire line only between the armies of Israel and the armies of Jordan, as these armies stand at the time of this armistice ceasefire agreement, and are expressly not political borders without claim to either side's claims to where the political borders should be. So when the media elevates the significance of these 1949 ceasefire lines, which were superseded by the 1967 ceasefire lines between the same warring parties, the media is imbuing into these 1949 ceasefire lines a political borders gravitas that never really existed and is misleading the publics. The next, and the ninth of the 10 misleading expressions we would leave you with today, is occupation. Naftali Bennett, an Israeli minister who is, by my view, fortunately outspoken, said, "We are not occupiers. You cannot be an occupier in your own home." And when we ourselves talk about one side of the green line, the 1949 ceasefire lines, being Israel proper, and the other side being the Palestinian territories, let alone the occupied Palestinian territories, we ourselves are conceding a victory to the Arab side in equity in those areas. We need to not say Palestinian territories. We need to say disputed territories, even better, Judea and Samaria, because that's the historical reality. There are today growing institutions in Israel and in the diaspora which take these historical claims and our failure to make these historical claims seriously. One of them is Legal Grounds, and it is worth going to their website to look and see the arguments that they make, that we should have been making all of this time, that we are as much entitled to the homeland of the Jewish people as other peoples are entitled to their homelands, and we failed to make it. We talk about settlements, we talk about West Bank, we talk about occupied. It doesn't make sense not to make the argument that the Jewish people has a bona fide historical and legal claim to the entirety of the land of Israel, not just inside the quote green line. Finally, of the 10, and there's a tremendous number, greater than 10, of misleading media expressions that we go to some length in our treatment in our book, which we show Pressing Israel Media Bias Exposed from A to Z. So there's at least 26 of them. The 10th one I would give you today is refugee camps and settlements. In a, I think, unthinking expression, the Philadelphia Inquirer House World Affairs columnist, who is not empathetic to Israel, referred to a Palestinian Arab living in his, quote, family's comfortable row house in a refugee camp in Palestine. This image that you get in your mind when you hear the expression refugee camp is like a wind-blown hilltop with freezing people standing in front of campfires built in front of windswept tents. That's not what the Arab refugees, who alone of all the refugees in the world are allowed to call their children, their grandchildren, and their great-great-grandchildren refugees. And it is perpetuating a conflict by preserving that status, and it's not right, and it's not accurate. This is the settlement of Mele Adumim, a suburb of Jerusalem, as seen from Mount Scopus in Jerusalem. This is not a settlement any more than the man with his comfortable row house was a refugee camp. It's just more expressions that are part of this whole loaded lexicon of poison pejoratives in which the media reports the Arab-Israeli conflict with utterly insufficient resistance to that narrative of inaccuracy by ourselves. I'll leave you with this. The Philadelphia Inquirer not that long ago had a political cartoon, editorial cartoon, in which it invokes Moses at the Red Sea saying to Bibi, enough with the settlements already. Moses would have been the last person in the last 3,000 years to have said to the Jewish people, the land of Israel is only inside the green line. Thank you.